Insert music here. 2,000 years later, 6.5 hours later, a few inches later, day 2, day 3, day 4, a few moments later, 1 eternity later, 3 days later, 12 seconds later, 3:28 a.m., 3 weeks later, many months later. Some say that the old hour got tired waiting and they had to hire a new one. Tomorrow for sure. Eventually, 12 o'clock midnight, 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later. You move along, running out of time cards. Email 8:01 p.m. the next day later, 20 minutes later, 6 hours later, several bad puns later. 70 years later, email 6 hours later that same evening, several days later, 6 months later, 2 hours later, 4 to 6 weeks later, 1 minute 37 seconds later, 1 debt to society later, 1 pair of pants later, 8 hours later, 298 frozen patties later, 3 hours later. Epilogue next day. Meanwhile, at Krusty Krab, 10 seconds later, 346 minutes later, much later, 6 days later, late opening night later, 3,000 years later, 1 week later, 7:59 a.m., 3 weeks later, 3 days later, 2 hours later, 48 hours later, 8 hours later, 12 Thursday, 5 minutes later, 24 hours later, much later, 3,000 hours later, blog, several song-filled hours later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 days later, 15 minutes later, several months later, thousands of tears later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 2 hours later, much later, yesterday, 20 hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 4 minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 minute later, starting day, meanwhile, later. Justin! That follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands, 1 frozen with sun later, 1 hour later, 5 hours later, 2 days later, in the void, approximately 10 hours later, early next morning, 1 shift later, 2 weeks later, 11 minutes later, 5 minutes later, a lot of boiling math later, 24 hours later, 1 week later, 1 long angry line later, 72 hours later, 2 hours later. Just then, by sheer coincidence, next morning, montage. Next morning, many tic-tacs later, flashback, and the flashback the very next evening, 1 hour later, the next day later, 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later, next morning, moments later, more moments later, 1 semester later, graduation day. 1 hour later, 5 minutes later, 80,000 impressions later. Would you please stop imitating me? It's starting to get very annoying. 3 hours of whoop-poos later, soon after later, moments later, next morning, many unbearable hours later, 82 kilometers later, a little later, 3 hours later, 1 season later, many secret parties later, months later, 1 nap later, 1 very long digested tract later, 6 months later, 1 pathetic stop story later, many Many minutes later. 3 hours later. One next morning. 1 shift later. The next day. The next morning. Later. The next. The next morning. Later that night. Next day. 1 weekend of pampering later. 1 hour later. Late again. You get the idea. 10,000 celebrities later. Meanwhile, 1 later booster service later. Few minutes later. 1 hour later. 5 billion years later.